The Empress architect Veth Kala had never met a species that built downward before. She stood at the observation rail of the survey cruiser, unending patience, and watched the pale green structure on the ocean floor from through a magnification lens so precise she could read the writing on the side of it. 2 short syllables, human script. She'd had her translation engine working for 16 cycles now. It rendered the name as something like the green onion. She had it rendered again, still onion. She'd spent 40 years cataloging the homeworlds of 11 species, and none of them, not one, had ever named a survival habitat after a root vegetable. She called for Primus Commander Soth Va, and when he arrived, she handed him the lens without explanation. He looked for a long moment. Then he said, "Is that music?" The sonar team believes so. From inside the structure. From inside the structure. Floor of an ocean.
Yeah.
Sothva handed the lens back. Empress architect, humans have been surveyed 3 times prior. The consensus among the cataloging directorate is that they are a pre-space flight biological curiosity, mildly dangerous in the way of most apex predators, not a civilization of consequence, not a species that builds permanent habitats in their own hostile ocean floors. And yet, Vethkala said, Sothva had no answer for that. She had not expected one. The man who had built the green onion was named Frederick Elliott Marsh, and on the morning, the unending patience first appeared on the horizon of the Pacific. He was lying on his back in the access crawl space beneath the habitat's water recirculation unit with a wrench between his teeth and a flashlight duct taped to his forehead, trying to figure out which of his 17 plumbing decisions had been the wrong one. Dad. His daughter Lena was standing at the crawl space hatch. She was 17, and she had his same stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes, which were the kind that made you tell the truth whether you wanted to or not. Busy, he said around the wrench. There's something on the surface. Lena, it's big. He came out of the crawl space and looked at the monitors. He hadn't spent 11 years designing and building this habitat without designing and building a comprehensive sensor array into it. What the sensors were showing him made him set down the wrench with great deliberateness and stand very still for a moment. The object on the surface was 600 meters long. It displaced approximately 180,000 metric tons. Bulk composition matched nothing in his database, which included every naval vessel currently in service for every nation on Earth. He said, "Get your mother." He said it quietly enough that his son Callum heard the specific tone in it and stopped mid-chord on the guitar he'd been practicing and set it down without being asked. Her name was Carol Marsh, née Brightwater, and she had married an engineer because she thought that meant a steady income and sensible Christmases and a house with a normal foundation in a normal zip code. Instead, she had spent the last 3 years helping her husband move their family 90 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean into a pressure vessel that he'd named after produce. She was not, by any conventional measure, a fearful woman. She had a particular talent, which she'd discovered gradually over the years, for deciding what could and could not be solved by worrying about it. She looked at the sensor display. She looked at her husband. She said, "What do you need me to do?" That was the thing about Carol, always that. "What do you need me to do?" Fred said, "We need to make sure the kids don't panic." "The kids won't panic," Callum said from behind them. He was 15 and he'd been listening. "We're already 90 feet underwater. We hit the weird threshold about 3 months ago." Lena said, "What is it?" Fred pulled up the spectral analysis. "The hull composition doesn't match anything built on Earth. Propulsion signature is electromagnetic, but not in any frequency band we use." He paused. "It doesn't burn fuel." The room was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Carol said. She turned to the kids. "Father and I are going to figure out what to do. In the meantime, Callum, I need you to go check the oxygen mixing levels in the secondary tank because your father was under the recirculation unit and couldn't finish." "Mom, secondary oxygen tank, Cal." Callum went. He understood. "You do the thing that keeps you alive, and you let the people who know things figure out the things." It was the Marsh family's operating philosophy. It had gotten them through 11 years of Dad's next project, and it would get them through this. Architect Vethkala descended to the ocean floor in a survey vessel no larger than a courier shuttle. alone except for her research assistant Thiel, and a single security officer named Gorithis, who disapproved of this decision vocally and at length. They are a pre-spaceflight civilization, Gorithis said for the third time. They built a habitat on the floor of their ocean, Vethkala said. That is not pre-spaceflight thinking. That is pressure engineering. That is life support architecture. That is exactly the cognitive profile that produces spaceflight within 2 generations. We are not observing a curiosity. We are observing a civilization at the moment before it becomes something we will have to contend with. We could contend with it now while it is small. Or we could introduce ourselves, Vethkala said pleasantly, and see what they are made of. Gorithis made the sound that his species made when deeply unhappy about something but unable to argue further against it. Vethkala had heard that sound many times and she never tired of it. The survey vessel settled into the silt 40 meters from the Green Onion. Through the forward viewport she could see the warm light coming from inside it. Amber and domestic, the color of a place where someone lived. There were dolphins circling the habitat, 2 of them, and they seemed unbothered by the survey vessel's arrival. One of them came very close to the viewport and hung there in the water, regarding Vethkala with one dark eye, and then swam away. She had catalogued 11 species. None of them had made friends with the native megafauna before she arrived. She noted this in her research log. Then the exterior communication panel of the habitat lit up. Someone was trying to make contact. Fred had spent 20 minutes adapting the habitat's sonar communication array to broadcast on every frequency band he could identify from the alien vessel's passive emissions. It was the kind of problem he was genuinely good at. The kind that asked you to look at what you had and decide what it could be made to do. He had a $200,000 habitat, 2 dolphins who'd learned to open the exterior airlock because Lena had been feeding them sardines for 3 months. And a son had been experimenting with the habitat's acoustic dampening system to see if he could get better bass response in the living pod. 2. He used all 3. The dolphin's echolocation frequencies passed through Callum's modified acoustic system and rebroadcast through the sonar array, produced a signal that was mathematically complex, biologically patterned, and structured in ways that no human engineer would have thought to structure it. It was not a message. It was something better than a message. It was evidence of intention filtered through biology. Proof that the beings inside the green structure were capable of thinking sideways, of using what was at hand in ways that the thing had not been designed for. Vethkala listened to the signal for 43 seconds. Then she turned to Thiel and said, "They're already trying to talk to us, using their local fauna as a signal modulator." Thiel looked at her. That's not what pre-spaceflight civilizations do. No, Vethkala agreed. It is not. The first translated word came through 11 hours later. Fred had been awake for all 11 of them. Carol brought him coffee at hour 6 and sat with him, for a while, without talking, which was another one of her particular talents. At hour 9, she brought sandwiches. At hour 11, when the speaker array emitted a brief burst of modulated sound that Fred's frequency analysis software rendered as a single syllable that looked like the letter Q, followed by a gap, followed by something that might be a vowel. He ate half a sandwich without noticing, and only realized it when Carol pointed this out. "That's a name," he said. "That has to be a name. The cadence is right for a name." "Or a word for weather," Callum said. He'd been awake too, which Carol had decided not to fight for the last 4 hours, because the rule was you picked which hills to die on and this wasn't one. "You think aliens have a word for weather?" Lena asked. "I think if you live somewhere that has weather," Callum said, "you make a word for it pretty fast." Fred ran the syllable through 3 more analyses. Then he broadcast it back with a rising inflection. 20 seconds later, the response came, the same syllable, with a falling inflection, and then 2 new syllables. "They corrected my pronunciation," Fred said. He was smiling despite himself. He could feel Carol's look on the side of his face. "They corrected my pronunciation, and then they gave me more." "More what?" "More language. They're teaching us." He looked at the display. "They think we can learn." Empress architect Vethkala found that the marshes learned with unsettling speed. In 6 hours, she had an exchange of basic nouns. Within 20 hours, they had basic verbs and a rough grammar of the simplest Confederacy tongue. Then, within 30 hours, Frederick Marsh had asked her a question she had not expected. He asked, "Why here? Not what are you? Not where are you from? Here, why underwater? Why now? Why this particular structure, this particular family, this particular Tuesday?" She answered honestly. She said, "Because you built down." The pause before his next transmission was long enough that she thought she might have exceeded his translation capacity. Then he said, "Yeah, well, we were running out of room." The thing about the unending patience. Its Empress architect, its crew complement of 312, its weapons systems, which Gorthis had noted aloud were more than sufficient to reduce the green structure to scattered metal, was that it had arrived expecting to find a curiosity. What it found instead was a family. This sounds small. It was not small. The cataloging directorate had extensive records on the species-level characteristics of the 11 civilizations they'd encountered. Social structures, hierarchy patterns, reproductive strategies, conflict behavior. Species were characterized by their aggregate behaviors, their institutional tendencies, their broad cultural signatures. None of the directorate's frameworks had a category for what the green onion was. A voluntary compression of family unit under extreme environmental stress for the purpose of proving a technical concept, managed by a man who was clearly sleep-deprived, and a woman who was clearly more competent than any single situation was going to fully reveal, with two adolescent humans whose responses to an alien first contact event had been, in order, continue practicing guitar, check the secondary oxygen tank, ask if the aliens could see any of the dolphins, and request that someone tell them something interesting. That last request had come from Callum. He'd patched into the communication array at hour 16 and asked, in the rough pidgin that was developing, whether anything the survey vessel had encountered in its travels was more interesting than what it was encountering now. Veth Kala had asked her research assistant Thiel to look up the answer. Thiel came back with no. It wasn't diplomatic, it was accurate. The crisis, when it arrived, was not philosophical. It was the rival. The Marshes hadn't been down there alone. Fred's company competitor, a man named Gerald Cheever, who'd been trying to get Fred fired for 2 years, and had most recently pitched the board a deep-sea mineral extraction platform, whose design Fred had been publicly critical about for reasons, both personal and structural, had his construction vessels on the surface, and they were operating at night. Fred had known this. He'd mentioned it to Carol, in the way you mention a thing you're worried about, but haven't figured out how to solve yet. Cheever's crew did, at 3 in the morning, on day 22 of the 30-day trial, was siphon the secondary gas compression tank, the one that managed atmospheric balance when the main system ran heavy, the one that Callum had been sent to check on day 1. Fred felt it before the alarm went off. He had designed this building. He knew it sounds the way you know the breathing of a person sleeping beside you. He was awake and moving before the first alert light came on. The habitat began to tilt. 90 feet below the surface, in the dark, the green onion leaned 11 degrees to port, and the refrigerator door came open, and Carol's collection of small potted herbs. She'd insisted on bringing 3 of them, non-negotiable. Fred slid off the windowsill. Fred was already in the mechanical bay. Kurt Griffiths had watched the survey vessel's sensor array carefully for 22 days, and he had come to conclusions. The rival's construction platform was connected to the Marsh humans' corporate institutional structure. The depressurization event was sabotage, which was a concept Gorthis understood very well. He brought his analysis to Veth Kala at 300 hours. She was already at the communication array. "Telling them," Gorthis said. "I am telling them," she agreed. "Tenot. They can't understand our full technical language yet. They don't need our full technical language. They need to know it is the northwest compression fitting on the tertiary loop." She finished the transmission. "Watch." From the external sensor array, they could see the habitat tilted in the silt. The amber light inside dimmed but not gone. They could see, after about 90 seconds, a human figure in a pressure suit exit the habitat's secondary lock and move along the exterior hull in the dark. Frederick Marsh, 90 feet underwater, in the dark, at 3 in the morning. moving along the outside of his building that someone had sabotaged, using a tool he'd grabbed on his way out. He found the fitting in 4 minutes. He had it sealed in 7. Goris watched this. He was quiet for a longer time than was usual for him. Then he said, "He didn't panic." "No," Vethkala said. "Species panic. Most species haven't chosen to live at the bottom of their ocean," she said. "You do not make that choice by accident. You make it because you are the kind of person who panics briefly, privately, and then picks up a wrench." The dolphins' names were Pip and March. Lena had named them. Fred had once gently suggested that naming the local wildlife might create unhealthy attachments, and Carol had pointed out that they were 90 feet underwater, eating recycled air, and the dolphins were the only other mammals for half a mile. So perhaps healthy and unhealthy were relative terms down here. Pip and March had become, without anyone formally deciding this, the habitat's exterior patrol system. They investigated anything that came near the hull. They reported to Lena by a series of behaviors she'd cataloged over 3 weeks. A specific circling pattern meant something large was nearby. A tail slap on the hull meant it was coming closer. A presentation of belly meant it was gone. When Cheever's underwater drone arrived on day 26, a remote-operated vehicle dispatched to finish what the gas siphoning had started. It was Pip and March who found it first. Tail slap woke Lena at 4 a.m. She woke her brother. Callum woke their parents. Fred looked at the exterior camera feed and recognized the drone's construction in about 3 seconds because he'd seen Cheever demo an early prototype at a conference 2 years ago and spent 40 minutes afterward telling Carol why the ballast design was going to be a problem. The ballast design was in fact a problem for Cheever because Fred knew exactly where it was. From the survey vessel, Vethkala watched the humans' plan unfold with what could only be described as professional admiration. Fred Marsh did not attempt to destroy the drone. He did not have the tools for it. What he had was a detailed understanding of the drone's structural weakness, 2 dolphins who had been trained by his daughter to respond to hand signals, and 11 years of designing systems that had to work the first time because failure 90 feet underwater was not an option. Callum's modified sonar array to project a low-frequency signal in the precise frequency band that would interfere with the drone's ballast sensors. He used Pip and March to herd it toward the interference zone. He used the tidal current, which he had been measuring every day for the 30-day trial, because he was the kind of man who measured things, to make the drone's corrective response predictable. The drone's ballast controller overcompensated. The drone spun. Its maneuvering thrusters fought the current in exactly the direction Fred had expected. It impacted the soft sediment of the ocean floor 40 meters from the habitat, stuck its nose in the silt, and its propulsion system burned out in under 20 seconds. Total cost to the Marsh family: 2 sardines, which Lena had used as signals for Pip and March. This looked at the sensor display for a very long time. Then he said, "Empress Architect, yes, I withdraw my earlier assessment." She waited. "They are not a pre-space flight curiosity," he said. "They are a problem, but not." He stopped himself. "Not the kind I initially meant." On day 29, Carol sat at the habitat's main viewport and watched a school of yellowfin tuna move through the light from the exterior lamps, and she thought about something. She thought about what it meant that they were still alive. Not in the abstract. In the specific, the sabotaged gas fitting, the tilting habitat, Fred moving along the outside of the hull in the dark, the drone, the dolphins, Callum, who had modified the acoustic system because he'd wanted better bass response, inadvertently producing a first contact communication tool, Lena, who had spent sardines on a relationship with 2 animals that had turned out to be the difference between a functioning habitat and a very expensive piece of salvage. None of these things had been planned. They were all products of the same basic impulse. Do the work in front of you well. Do it because it matters.
Do it even when, especially when...
No one is watching or approving or handing out a contract. She thought about the alien vessel above them. The one that had spent 29 days watching them do exactly this. She thought about Fred's original pitch to his boss, the one she'd heard him rehearse in the kitchen for 3 evenings. You can't ignore 1% of the Earth's surface just because it's underwater. She thought, Maybe that was what this whole thing had always actually been about. Not proving a concept, proving a species. Empress architect Veth Kala's formal report to the cataloging directorate was 17 pages long and included appendices on communication protocol development, novel applications of biological signal modulation, crisis response behavioral analysis, and interspecies trust formation timelines. It was the most detailed first contact report she had ever written. It would also be, she suspected, the most disputed. The directorate would want to categorize the humans. All 11 prior species had been categorized: pre-emergent, emergent, developing, established, advanced, senior. Clean columns, predictive modeling, resource allocation. The marshes did not fit the model. They were a single family unit who had chosen voluntary hardship to prove a point about human adaptability. They had responded to an unknown alien contact event with curiosity before fear, had developed a working communication protocol in 30 hours, had defeated sabotage through lateral thinking, and had, at various points, fed sardines to dolphins, filled a pressure vessel with amateur rock music, grown small herbs in a submarine, and named every significant piece of equipment in their habitat with what Fred explained was some affection and some irritation, depending on the day. The directorate had no column for this. She created one. She called it Incorrigibly Persistent. On the morning of day 30, Frederick Marsh put on his pressure suit for what he expected to be the last time, exited through the secondary lock, and performed a final external inspection of the green onion. He moved along the hull the way he always did, methodically, touching each junction point, checking each seal, reading the surface of his building the way you read a face for signs of hidden strain. He'd done this every 3 days since they arrived. He'd done it the night Cheever's drone came, in the dark, with an alien vessel watching him. Did it now in the early morning, Pacific light, filtering down through 90 feet of water, making everything look like the inside of an aquarium. He had a flashlight duct taped to his helmet. Same as always. He was almost back to the entry lock when he saw it. A new marking on the hull, just below the viewport of the main living pod, where Lena sat to watch the fish. Someone had etched something into the hull material in the night, in a script that was not any human writing system. He floated there in the water and looked at it for a while. Then he took a photograph. Then he went inside. Carol was making coffee. Callum was asleep. Lena was at her viewport, watching a pair of yellowfin move through the morning light. And she looked up when he came in. "Writing on the hull," he said. She looked unsurprised. "I saw one of the lights from the other ship moving around out there. Around 2 in the morning. I thought someone was checking something." Someone was. He handed her his camera. She looked at the image and handed it to Carol, who was already at the communication array. 10 minutes later, Fred had a translation. It read, "This place has been noted. Those within it have been seen. The record will say, they chose the difficult direction and they were not diminished by it." He read it twice. He sat down with his coffee. He sat with it for a while. Then he said, in the rough pidgin that had become his and Veth Kala's working language, tell her, that we were just trying to prove it could work." The response came back in under a minute. She says, "That is what all the great ones say." The unending patience left the Pacific on day 31, which was also the day Frederick Marsh's 30-day trial concluded, the day his boss approved the green onion for commercial development, and the day the sonar specialist on a nearby naval destroyer filed a report stating that the unidentified signals he'd been tracking had ceased and the ocean floor appeared to contain nothing of military consequence. The naval report was technically accurate. The directorate's record was more complete. Veth Kala's entry for the human species had 17 pages of formal analysis, and then, at the end, a personal note that was not standard procedure, and which she added anyway. It said, "They built downward when they ran out of room. This is the kind of thinking that builds civilizations. They were afraid, and they did it anyway. This is the kind of courage that sustains them. They named their habitat after a root vegetable and brought houseplants 90 feet below the surface of their ocean. This is the kind of stubbornness that makes them, in my considered professional opinion, someone else's problem eventually. I recommend we introduce ourselves properly before that day comes. because meeting them on their terms will be considerably easier than meeting them on ours. They have already demonstrated that on their terms, in their element, under pressure, with sardines and duct tape and a pair of dolphins, they are, as a species, almost entirely undefeatable. This is not a threat assessment. It is an admiration. She filed it. She did not edit it. The cataloging directorate would object. She already knew this. She also knew, because she had been doing this for 40 years and she had learned to trust what the evidence said, even when it was inconvenient, that she was right. The humans had not noticed that they were being tested. That was the most important thing she wrote down. They had not been performing. They had simply been themselves. A man who built toward the hostile unknown, because the math said they were running out of alternatives. A woman who asked what needs to be done, and then did it. 2 children who practiced music and fed dolphins and checked oxygen tanks and learned alien grammar in their spare time. As though all of this were simply the next thing, the obvious next thing. The thing you did because you were alive, and there was work to be done. This was not what civilizations at the edge of emergence looked like in the Directorate's models. But the models, Vethkala had always thought, had been written by people who'd never sat 90 feet underwater and watched a human being fix a sabotaged gas fitting in the dark by flashlight without once looking up to check whether anyone was watching. 3 years later, when the first formal diplomatic contact between the human species and the Confederacy of Witness was established, the Confederacy's opening representative brought with her a small item that had been carefully cataloged and preserved. She placed it on the table between the delegations. It was a small clay pot, sealed with archival resin, containing the desiccated remains of a herb plant. It had been recovered from the interior of the Green Onion during the survey vessel's final passive scan. The human delegation's lead negotiator, a woman with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the Confederacy representative. "Where did you get that?" "It was in the record," the representative said. "Everything in the record is preserved. That is the first rule of the cataloging directorate, even the small things." The human negotiator. Lena Marsh, 31 years old, the first human to formally speak to a Confederacy diplomat, who had once spent a summer feeding sardines to dolphins 90 feet below the Pacific, looked at the clay pot with her mother's herbs in it for a long time. Then she said, she kept it. The representative, Thiel, research assistant to Empress Architect Veth Kala, retired, now serving as first diplomatic liaison to the human species, said, "We keep everything, even the things that aren't important." Thiel considered this carefully. The way he always considered things, which was to say thoroughly and without shortcuts, he said, are often the most important. Lena reached out and touched the side of the pot, just a fingertip, just for a moment. Then she sat back and picked up her pen and got to work. That was the Marsh family's operating philosophy. It was, Vethkala had written in the last line of her report, possibly also humanities. That alone, she'd noted, probably with some affection, probably with some irritation, depending on the day, was enough.